A nation forged in dust and determination. Australia in the 19th century. In the early 1800s, the land that would become modern Australia was immense, unpredictable, and only partly understood by its European settlers. Along the eastern edge of the continent, the colony of Sydney clung nervously to the coast. Beyond it stretched vast plains, dense bushland, winding rivers, and mountain ranges that seemed to guard the interior like a wall. To the British Empire, Australia had begun as a penal settlement, a distant solution to overcrowded prisons. But by the 1820s, it was becoming something more. Convicts still arrived in chains, yet free settlers were increasing. Ambition was replacing mere survival. In 1827, during the governorship of Ralph Darling, New South Wales was shifting from punishment to possibility. Farmers pushed beyond the Blue Mountains, whose crossing only years earlier had once seemed impossible. Surveyors mapped new rivers and grazing lands. Sheep stations spread across inland plains, feeding a wool industry that would soon power the colonial economy. Among the settlers were migrants who came willingly, drawn by opportunity. One might imagine a young Scottish immigrant named Thomas McAllister. Unlike transported convicts, he chose the journey, leaving behind familiar hills for a land of heat, dust, and promise. He settled beyond the mountains, where open grasslands offered hope of prosperity. But Australia rarely gave fortune easily. The frontier tested everyone. Drought could crack the earth for months without mercy. Floodwaters could undo years of work overnight. Isolation weighed heavily. Neighbors might be days away, news weeks old. Life required resilience. And the expansion carried a darker reality. As settlers claimed land, Indigenous Australians, whose connection to country stretched back tens of thousands of years, faced displacement, violence, and profound disruption. The growth of the colonies came at enormous human cost. By mid-century, everything changed again. In 1851, gold was discovered near Bathurst in New South Wales, and soon after in Ballarat in Victoria. What followed was extraordinary. The gold rush transformed Australia almost overnight. Ships poured into Melbourne's harbour. People arrived from Britain, Ireland, China, Europe, and America, all chasing the same glittering dream. The quiet colonies became restless and loud. Canvas tents covered hillsides. Muddy tracks replaced bushland. Fortunes were found and lost in a matter of days. For struggling farmers facing drought, goldfields offered desperate hope. Many left their properties behind to try their luck. Thomas, now older and worn by years of hard seasons, might have made that same choice, leaving his land to his son and heading south. But life on the diggings was harsh. Mining licenses were expensive. Authorities enforced them aggressively, conducting sudden inspections and imposing heavy fines. Resentment simmered among miners who felt exploited and voiceless. In 1854, that resentment exploded at Ballarat in what became known as the Eureka Rebellion. Miners built a crude stockade and raised the Southern Cross flag, demanding fair treatment and political representation. Government troops stormed the barricade at dawn. The clash was brief and bloody. Militarily, the miners were defeated. Politically, their stand reshaped the colonies. Reforms followed. License systems changed. Representation broadened. The spirit of democratic resistance took root. From the goldfields emerged something uniquely Australian, a deep suspicion of unfair authority, fierce loyalty among mates, and belief in a fair go for ordinary people. As the 1860s and 1870s unfolded, progress accelerated. Railways began linking inland towns to coastal ports. Telegraph wires stretched across thousands of kilometers, shrinking distances that once felt endless. In 1872, the Overland Telegraph Line connected Adelaide to Darwin, linking Australia to the global communication network. News that once took months by ship could now arrive in hours. The continent felt less isolated. Towns grew where bushland once stood untouched. Wool exports expanded. Agriculture flourished. Young workers laid iron tracks across Victoria and New South Wales, hammering steel into sleepers under wide, unbroken skies. Yet prosperity was uneven and fragile. The 1890s brought severe economic depression. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, workers lost jobs, shearers and maritime laborers went on strike, demanding fair wages and safer conditions. These struggles strengthened organized labor and reshaped colonial politics. Out of hardship grew a powerful idea: federation. Leaders began serious discussions about uniting the separate colonies into one nation. Many Australians no longer saw themselves simply as British subjects in scattered settlements. They saw themselves as part of something distinct, shaped by distance, hardship, and shared experience. Thomas McAllister did not live to see the Commonwealth of Australia proclaimed in 1901. He died in 1898 on his modest farm, surrounded by children and grandchildren who already thought of this land not as a distant colony, but as home. His life mirrored the transformation of a century. He arrived in a penal outpost at the edge of empire. He witnessed gold fever, rebellion, technological triumph, depression, and the rise of democratic ideals. By the time he died, Australia was no longer merely surviving, it was defining itself. The 1800s in Australia were marked by struggle, ambition, conflict, and resilience. From convict beginnings to gold rush upheaval, from frontier farms to telegraph wires spanning deserts, the century forged more than infrastructure. It forged identity. Across rolling plains, dusty goldfields, and railway towns carved from bush, Australians developed values born of hardship: mateship, fairness, endurance, and quiet defiance in the face of injustice. The iron tracks laid in the 19th century carried more than trains. They carried the destiny of a nation. From federation to a new identity. On 1 January 1901, as the sun rose over Sydney Harbour, a new nation was proclaimed: the Commonwealth of Australia. After decades of debate, negotiation, and compromise, the 6 colonies united under one federal government. Fireworks lit the skies. Crowds gathered in celebration. The Constitution came into force, and Australia stepped into the 20th century, no longer as separate colonies, but as a nation. For families like the McAllisters, federation was not an abstract political achievement. It was the culmination of a lifetime of change. What had once been scattered settlements clinging to survival were now connected by rail, telegraph, shared trade, and shared ideals. But nationhood did not mean certainty. Australia remained closely tied to Britain. Loyalty to the empire ran deep. Most Australians still thought of themselves as British subjects first and Australians second. That loyalty would soon be tested in ways no one could yet imagine. The early Commonwealth years. The first years of federation were filled with optimism. A new parliament was established in Melbourne before eventually moving to Canberra. Policies were introduced to shape the young nation's identity and economy. One of the earliest and most defining was the White Australia policy, legislation designed to restrict non-European immigration.
At the time, many supported it as protection for wages and social cohesion. Today, it stands as a reminder that Australia's early national identity was built alongside exclusion and racial prejudice. Meanwhile, industries expanded. Wool remained king. Mining towns continued to grow. Manufacturing slowly increased in urban centers like Sydney and Melbourne. The population climbed steadily. The sons of pioneers became railway workers, factory hands, school teachers, and small business owners. The rough frontier was gradually giving way to towns with brick buildings, post offices, and cricket grounds. Australia was beginning to feel settled. Then came 1914. When Britain declared war on Germany, Australia followed without hesitation. Thousands of young men volunteered, believing it their duty to defend the empire. Among them were grandsons of settlers like Thomas McAllister, farm boys, clerks, laborers, and students. They sailed halfway across the world to fight in places many had never heard of. In 1915, Australian and New Zealand troops landed at Gallipoli. The campaign was disastrous militarily. Harsh terrain, fierce resistance, disease, and miscalculation led to devastating casualties. Yet Gallipoli became central to Australia's emerging identity. The courage, endurance, and mateship displayed by the soldiers shaped the ANZAC legend. Though the campaign failed, it marked a psychological turning point. Australians began to see themselves as distinct, capable, resilient, and forged by shared sacrifice rather than simply colonial loyalty. By the war's end in 1918, over 60,000 Australians had died. In small towns and city suburbs alike, memorials rose in honor of the fallen. The cost of nationhood had become painfully real. Between wars, hope and hardship. The 1920s brought recovery and cautious optimism. Returned soldiers were granted land in settlement schemes, though many struggled with poor soil and limited support. Cities expanded. Cars replaced horses. Cinemas flickered with new entertainment. Women who had gained the federal vote in 1902 continued pushing for greater equality. But prosperity was fragile. In 1929, the Great Depression struck. Banks failed, businesses collapsed, unemployment soared to nearly 1/3 of the workforce. Families lost homes, men lined up for food relief. Swagmen wandered rural roads in search of work, their stories later woven into folklore and song. The hardship echoed the droughts and depressions of the 1800s, another test of endurance. Communities relied on one another. Trade unions grew stronger. Governments experimented with new economic policies. Again and again, Australians adapted. World War II and independence. In 1939, war returned. This time, the threat felt closer. When Japan entered the war in 1941, Australian cities faced direct danger. Darwin was bombed. Submarines entered Sydney Harbor. For the first time, invasion seemed possible. Australia turned increasingly toward the United States for support, marking a shift in foreign policy that would last generations. The war effort mobilized the entire population. Men enlisted, women entered factories and military services. Industry expanded rapidly. By 1945, the war was over, but Australia had changed profoundly. The sense of automatic dependence on Britain had faded. The country had acted more independently, forged new alliances, and strengthened its own institutions. The transformation begun in the 1800s was accelerating. Building modern Australia. After the war, the government launched a massive immigration program. Populate or perish became the rallying cry. Millions arrived from Europe. Italians, Greeks, Dutch, Germans, and later migrants from across the globe. Snowy Mountain hydro workers blasted tunnels through alpine rock. Suburbs expanded around every major city. Australia was becoming multicultural, even if slowly and sometimes reluctantly. The White Australia policy was gradually dismantled, formally ending in the 1970s. Indigenous Australians, long excluded from political recognition, fought for civil rights. The 1967 referendum overwhelmingly approved changes to the Constitution to include Aboriginal people in the national census and allow the federal government to make laws for them. The national story widened. From colony to confidence. By the late 20th century, Australia had fully stepped out of Britain's shadow. The Australia Act of 1986 severed remaining constitutional ties to the UK. Economic reforms reshaped markets. Cultural confidence grew through literature, film, sport, and the arts. Yet the foundations remained visible. The mateship spoken of at Eureka echoed at Gallipoli. The resilience of drought-stricken farmers lived on in Depression-era battlers. The railway lines and telegraph wires of the 19th century had evolved into highways and digital networks, but the instinct to connect vast distances endured. The story that began as a penal settlement had become something far more complex. Australia's identity was forged in contradiction, hardship and opportunity, exclusion and inclusion, loyalty and independence, struggle and renewal. From frontier farms beyond the Blue Mountains to global cities on the Pacific Rim, the nation continued to evolve. And just as the iron tracks of the 19th century once carried the destiny of a young colony, the generations that followed carried forward something even more enduring. A belief that across distance, adversity, and change, Australia would endure, adapt, and define itself on its own terms.
A modern Australia finds its voice. By the 1970s, Australia stood at a crossroads. The long shadow of empire had faded. The old certainty of British identity no longer defined the nation. What remained was a young country still shaping itself, questioning its past, redefining its future. The dismantling of the White Australia policy marked a turning point. Immigration no longer centered solely on Britain and Europe. Families arrived from Vietnam, Lebanon, China, India, and across the globe. Suburbs transformed. New languages echoed in schoolyards. Food, music, faith, and tradition reshaped city streets. Australia was no longer becoming multicultural. It was multicultural. This shift did not happen without tension. Change rarely does. But over time, diversity became one of the country's defining strengths. The nation that once feared difference slowly began to celebrate it. The long road of reconciliation. Yet one unfinished story demanded deeper attention. For nearly 2 centuries, Indigenous Australians had endured dispossession, violence, discrimination, and forced removal from land and family. By the late 20th century, the call for recognition and justice grew impossible to ignore. The 1967 referendum had been a major milestone. In the decades that followed, land rights cases reshaped legal understanding. In 1992, the High Court's Mabo decision rejected the doctrine of terra nullius, the idea that Australia had belonged to no one before British settlement. It was a profound moment. The nation formally acknowledged that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had lived on and cared for this land for tens of thousands of years before colonization.
In 2008, the Australian Parliament delivered a formal apology to the stolen generations, Indigenous children removed from their families under government policy. It was not the end of the journey, but it marked an important step toward reconciliation. The modern Australian identity increasingly recognizes that its story did not begin in 1788. It began tens of thousands of years earlier. Economic change and global ties. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Australia's economy transformed again. Manufacturing declined. Services, education, mining exports, and technology rose. Trade ties deepened with Asia, particularly China, Japan, and South Korea. The country's geographic location, once seen as isolation, became strategic advantage. Cities like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth grew into vibrant global hubs. Universities attracted international students. Australian film, literature, and sport projected confidence abroad. Yet the land itself remained a constant presence. Droughts still tested farmers. Bushfires burned with terrifying intensity. Floods reshaped communities overnight. Climate became not just background reality, but urgent national conversation. The ancient continent still demanded resilience. Identity in the 21st century. Australia carries layers of history. Convict beginnings, Gold Rush rebellion, Federation optimism, war sacrifice, migration and multicultural renewal, Indigenous resilience and recognition. Each layer adds complexity. Australians today debate their future openly, republic or monarchy, constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples, climate responsibility, economic fairness. The national character, shaped in dust and distance, remains practical yet reflective. Mateship still holds meaning, seen in bushfire volunteers, flood rescue crews, and community fundraisers. The belief in a fair go continues to influence politics and social policy. Suspicion of arrogance and authority remains part of cultural instinct. And yet, Australia is no longer uncertain of itself. It is a confident, diverse democracy in the Asia-Pacific, tied to its past but not bound by it. The continuing story. If Thomas McAllister could stand today on the land he once farmed, he might not recognize the highways, the satellite dishes, the multicultural towns, but he would recognize something deeper. The wide sky, the stubborn earth, the resilience of those who call it home. From the penal colony clinging to Sydney Cove to a nation of more than 25 million people, Australia's journey has been shaped by hardship and possibility in equal measure. The iron rails of the 19th century carried wool and wheat. The telegraph wires carried news. The ships carried migrants. The soldiers carried sacrifice. And now, modern Australians carry something just as powerful, the responsibility to shape the next chapter. Because the story of Australia has never been finished. It is still being written across red desert horizons, coastal cities, remote communities, and suburban streets. A nation forged in dust and determination continues to evolve, and its destiny, as always, travels forward in the hands of its people.
The Australia of tomorrow. In the 21st century, Australia stands not at the edge of the world, but at the center of a shifting one. The old anxieties of isolation have given way to a different reality. Australia is deeply connected, economically, culturally, digitally. News travels instantly. Trade flows across oceans in hours. Families are linked across continents by more than letters carried on ships.
Yet even in an age of satellites and smartphones, the vastness of the land still shapes the nation's character. From the red heart of the interior to the coral stretches of the Great Barrier Reef, from booming coastal cities to remote indigenous communities, Australia remains a continent of contrasts. Wealth and hardship sit side by side. Opportunity expands, but not always equally. Climate, land, and responsibility. In recent years, Australians have faced reminders that nature still commands respect. The Black Summer bushfires of 2019 to 2020 scorched millions of hectares, destroyed homes, and claimed lives. Smoke darkened skies across cities. Communities rallied, volunteers crossed state borders, donations poured in from around the world. Floods followed in other seasons. Drought tightened its grip across rural regions. Climate change is no longer an abstract debate, it is lived experience. Farmers adjust planting cycles. Coastal communities confront rising seas. Policymakers wrestle with balancing mining exports and renewable energy transitions. The land that once tested pioneers continues to test their descendants. But resilience remains a defining trait. A changing democracy. Modern Australia is also navigating questions of identity and governance. In 2023, Australians voted in a referendum on establishing an Indigenous voice to Parliament. The proposal was not carried. For many, it was a moment of disappointment. For others, a reflection of differing views on constitutional change. Yet the broader conversation about recognition and reconciliation continues. Across communities, schools, and workplaces, Australians grapple with how to honor the world's oldest continuing cultures while shaping a shared future. Debate, sometimes heated, often passionate, is part of democratic maturity. From the miners at Eureka to unionists in the 1890s, from suffragettes to civil rights campaigners, Australians have long argued about fairness. The instinct to challenge and discuss is woven into the national fabric. Diversity as strength. Walk through modern Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, or Perth, and the Australia of the 1800s feels distant. Languages from every continent mingle in cafes and classrooms. Festivals celebrate Diwali, Lunar New Year, Eid, Christmas, and NAIDOC Week. More than half the population has either been born overseas or has at least one parent who was. The nation that once enforced racial exclusion now publicly embraces multicultural identity as core strength. That journey was neither quick nor smooth, but it has reshaped the country profoundly. Sporting fields, universities, small businesses, scientific research labs all reflect this diversity. Australian athletes compete under a single flag, but their stories trace to every corner of the globe. The idea of what an Australian looks like has expanded and continues to expand. Innovation and the Asia-Pacific century. Geographically anchored in the Asia-Pacific, Australia's future is increasingly tied to the region. Trade with Asian economies drives growth. Strategic partnerships shape security. Universities educate students from across Southeast Asia and beyond. Technological innovation is rising in renewable energy, medical research, space exploration, and digital industries. Solar farms stretch across sunburnt plains. Startups emerge in urban hubs. Scientists collaborate globally. The old image of Australia as merely a supplier of wool and gold has shifted. Knowledge, services, and creativity now travel alongside iron ore and natural gas. Still, the echoes of the past remain. The railway lines of the 19th century have become highways and fiber optic cables. The telegraph's shrinking of distance has evolved into instant global communication. The gold rush hunger for opportunity survives in entrepreneurial risk-taking. History does not disappear. It transforms. The unfinished chapter. Australia today is neither the fragile colony of 1827 nor the uncertain federation of 1901. It is a stable democracy with strong institutions, yet not immune to global pressures, economic shocks, geopolitical tensions, pandemics, climate events. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed both vulnerability and solidarity. Borders closed, communities adapted, healthcare workers carried extraordinary burdens, neighbors supported neighbors. The instinct of mateship resurfaced in new forms: food deliveries, welfare checks, shared endurance. Each generation meets its own tests, and each leaves its imprint. Looking forward. If we trace the arc from convict ships to container ports, from bush stockades to parliamentary debates, from telegraph poles to satellites, one theme remains constant. Australians endure. They argue, they rebuild, they adapt, they push outward, geographically and socially. They question authority when it feels unjust. They value community in times of crisis. The iron rails of the 19th century once carried the destiny of a young colony. Today, the carriers are different. Education, innovation, reconciliation, environmental stewardship, democratic engagement. But the responsibility is the same: to shape a nation worthy of its vast landscape and layered history. The story that began with uncertainty on a distant shore is still unfolding. Across city skylines and desert horizons, across indigenous communities and migrant suburbs, across farms, mines, beaches, and boardrooms, the next chapter waits to be written. Australia was forged in dust and determination. Its future will be forged in courage, compassion, and choice. And as always, the journey continues.
The legacy we carry. Every nation has a story. Australia's began not with certainty, but with risk, a fragile outpost on an ancient shore, unsure whether it would survive. What followed across 2 centuries was not a straight line of triumph, but a winding path through hardship, contradiction, courage, and reinvention. Now, in the quiet spaces between history and tomorrow, the question is no longer how Australia was built. The question is how it will be carried forward. The weight of memory. The past does not vanish. It settles into the landscape. It rests in sandstone buildings overlooking Sydney Harbour. It echoes in the wind across sheep stations beyond the Blue Mountains. It lingers in the red earth of inland towns and in the goldfields of Ballarat. It speaks through the world's oldest continuing cultures whose connection to country predates all colonial chapters. Modern Australia holds these layers simultaneously. The convict legacy, once a mark of shame, has transformed into a symbol of endurance and unlikely beginnings. The gold rushes remind us that ambition can build cities overnight. The ANZAC legend speaks of sacrifice, mateship, and resilience under impossible strain. The waves of migration tell of reinvention again and again. Each chapter leaves both pride and discomfort, and maturity as a nation means holding both. The ongoing conversation. Australia is still debating itself. How do we recognize Indigenous Australians meaningfully in the nation's founding document? How do we balance economic prosperity with environmental stewardship? How do we remain secure in a complex geopolitical region while staying true to democratic values? How do we ensure that the fair go extends to everyone? These are not weaknesses, they are signs of a living democracy.
From shearers' strikes in the 1890s to referendums in the modern era, Australians have never shied away from argument. Disagreement is part of the national temperament, often blunt, sometimes rough-edged, but rarely silent. The instinct to question power runs deep. The land endures. Through every era, one constant remains: the land itself. Australia is not a small island nation tucked into gentle geography. It is a continent of extremes: flood and fire, reef and desert, snowfields and tropical wetlands, isolation and vast sky. The land shapes perspective. It humbles. It demands respect. Those who farm it, mine it, protect it, and study it know that progress must reckon with environment. Climate change has sharpened that awareness. The future will depend not only on economic strength, but ecological wisdom. The ancient custodians understood that balance long before federation, gold, or railways. Listening more closely may be one of the nation's most important next steps. Identity without edges. Perhaps the most profound transformation across 2 centuries is this: Australia no longer fits a single definition. It is indigenous and immigrant, urban and rural, secular and spiritual, British-influenced yet Asia-Pacific connected, laid back in myth, ambitious in reality. There is no single Australian face, accent, or background, and that diversity, once feared, has become ordinary. Children in classrooms today inherit a country shaped by convict grit, frontier risk, gold rush daring, wartime sacrifice, migrant courage, and indigenous endurance. They grow up with global awareness unimaginable to settlers in 1827. And yet, some values persist almost unchanged. Help your neighbor. Give people a fair chance. Stand up when something feels wrong. Don't take yourself too seriously. Respect the land that sustains you. These threads run quietly through generations. The next horizon. If the 19th century built survival, if the 20th century built nationhood, then the 21st century must build responsibility. Responsibility to history, truthfully told. Responsibility to diversity, genuinely embraced. Responsibility to the environment, carefully protected. Responsibility to democracy, actively defended. The iron rails once carried wool and wheat across vast distances. The telegraph carried news. Ships carried migrants. Digital networks now carry ideas at the speed of light. But none of these carry destiny alone. People do. Australia's story has never been written by governments alone, nor by explorers, soldiers, or politicians in isolation. It has been written by ordinary people, farmers facing drought, miners demanding justice, migrants starting again, teachers shaping young minds, volunteers fighting bushfires, scientists searching for solutions. The next chapter will be written the same way. A story still unfolding. In the end, the most remarkable thing about Australia is not how it began, but how it continues. A penal colony became a democracy. A scattered set of colonies became a federation. A racially exclusive policy became a multicultural society. A distant outpost became a confident regional voice. And still it evolves. Across red deserts at sunset, across bustling harbors at dawn, across suburban streets and remote communities, the nation breathes, argues, builds, reflects. The destiny once carried by iron tracks now rests in shared choices. Australia was forged in dust and determination. Its future will be shaped by wisdom, courage and the willingness to keep walking forward together. And like the horizon stretching endlessly beyond the outback, the story does not end here. It simply opens into the next chapter.